The road curled through the Blue Ridge Mountains like a ribbon unraveling toward memory. It was the kind of spring afternoon that clung to your skin, moist, alive, buzzing with unseen energy. Birds sang in the distance, and the scent of honeysuckle drifted through the cracked window of the rental car. Emma Carter squinted at her GPS, then glanced at the handwritten note from her editor. The Reed estate. Worth your time. Mysterious owner. Untouched history. Could be a front-page piece. But be careful. Elias Reed is different. Margot. Different. Emma scoffed quietly. She'd met plenty of different people. Cranky historians, doomsday preppers, war veterans with broken minds and brilliant stories. She wasn't afraid of eccentricity. She welcomed it. It was good for business. Her car crested a small hill, and suddenly the trees opened like theater curtains. There it was. The house stood alone, like something time forgot. Not ruined, not haunted, but watchful. 3 stories of Southern Gothic charm. Wraparound porches, towering shutters, vines choking the railings like ivy reclaiming a memory. The white paint peeled like old secrets. The gravel crunched under her tires as she pulled into the circular driveway. In the center was a dried-out fountain, overgrown with moss and lavender. The house didn't whisper. It waited. Emma grabbed her leather bag and slung it over one shoulder, her camera and notebook nestled inside. Her heels crunched gravel as she walked toward the heavy oak door. Before she could knock, it opened. A man stepped out, tall, lean, dressed in a dark suit like time had frozen in the 1950s. Silver hair slicked back. His face, weathered but sharp. Eyes like storm clouds. "You must be Miss Carter," he said. His voice was velvet with an edge of iron. "I've been expecting you." "Elias Reed?" she asked, surprised by his elegance. "In the flesh." He stepped aside. "Welcome to Halcyon House." Halcyon, a name that meant peace, but she felt anything but. She stepped over the threshold and into another world. The air inside was cool, almost chilled, like a breath drawn in and never released. Emma paused at the entrance hall, trying to absorb the quiet grandeur. High ceilings crowned in ornate molding, walls lined with oil paintings of people who watched her too closely. The house smelled faintly of cedarwood, old paper, and something harder to name, like history soaked into wood grain. Elias Reed closed the door gently behind her. "No one's lived here but me for the last 20 years, he said. "But the house remembers. It keeps things." Emma arched a brow. "Things like what?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Feelings. Moments. People." His words hung there, delicate as cobwebs. Then he turned and gestured toward a grand staircase with a carved banister so polished it reflected the flickering light. "Come, I'll show you the East Wing. That's where the good stories live." As they walked, Emma noticed how Elias moved, slowly, deliberately, as if each step was chosen carefully. His posture was perfect, military almost, and his hands stayed clasped behind his back until they stopped at a double door. "The Red Room," he said. "My favorite." He pushed the doors open with one hand. The room inside looked like the set of a Southern romance novel. Deep burgundy walls, velvet curtains, a mahogany fireplace, and a grand piano covered in dust. On the far wall, a collection of photographs was framed in gold. Emma stepped closer, her journalist instinct kicking in. One photo stopped her cold. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, smiled softly into the camera. Dark waves of hair spilled over her shoulders. There was something in her eyes, warmth, intelligence, sadness. But what struck Emma most was the familiarity. It was like looking into a version of herself from another life. Elias came to stand beside her. "Her name was Clara Monroe," he said quietly. "She lived here. A long time ago." "Was she family?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer would be more complicated than that. "No, not by blood." He paused. "She was everything." Emma swallowed hard. The air between them thickened. "You look like her," he added softly. "Not just in face. In spirit." Emma turned to him, startled. For a heartbeat, she thought he might touch her face. He didn't, but his gaze lingered a moment too long. "I think this house brought you here for a reason," he said. She took a step back, nerves fluttering like moths in her chest. "I'm here to write an article, Mr. Reed. That's all." "Elias," he corrected gently. "And I think you're here for more than that." Outside, thunder cracked, sharp, sudden, unnatural. The red room's chandelier trembled. Emma's breath caught. "What was that?" she asked. Elias turned to the window, unfazed. This house has a way of reacting to things, especially when they're being remembered. The storm outside hadn't arrived yet, but Emma could feel it in the air. It was in the way the wind toyed with the curtains, in the faint tremble of the chandelier above her, in the way Elias's eyes lingered too long on the portrait of Clara. She took a step away from the photo wall. She was beautiful. She was rare, Elias said simply, like certain flowers that only bloom once in a lifetime. Emma turned to face him. What happened to her? His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes dimmed, like someone closing a curtain. "People leave," he said, "by choice or by force. The result is the same. Emptiness." A long silence stretched between them. "I'd like to see the rest of the house," Emma said, shifting the conversation. Elias nodded once and led her through a narrow hallway that curved like a ribcage around the heart of the house. The floor creaked beneath them, but not unpleasantly. It was the sound of age, of weight carried well. They passed door after door, some slightly ajar, others locked with rusted keys still in place. Finally, they arrived at a small alcove tucked behind a tall bookcase. Elias reached out and, with surprising ease, slid the bookcase aside. Behind it was a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. Emma stiffened. "You've got a secret passage?" "Every southern house of a certain age has its sins," Elias replied. "This one keeps them well." He lit an old-fashioned lantern from a shelf nearby and offered it to her. She hesitated, her fingers brushing his. His skin was unexpectedly warm, steady. "You sure you're not trying to lure me into your murder dungeon?" He smiled. "You'd know it by now if that were my intention." The stairs were steep and narrow, and the air grew cooler with each step. At the bottom, the walls opened into a wide stone corridor lined with old sconces and candle holders. The space had the feel of a wine cellar crossed with a chapel, something sacred and secret. "This used to be a shelter during the war," Elias said, his voice echoing. "Later, I turned it into a personal archive and a sanctuary." They entered a large room with a vaulted ceiling and an old, scarred table in the center. Shelves lined the walls, full of books, files, old cameras, boxes marked with dates. One section caught Emma's eye, a collection of small, locked chests, each labeled with a single word. Names, maybe. She stepped closer and found one labeled Clara. Before she could ask, Elias stepped beside her and opened it without a word. Inside was a collection of delicate objects, a dried flower pressed between pages of a faded journal, a worn hairbrush with a few long strands still caught in its bristles, a folded letter sealed in wax. Emma picked up the letter. "May I?" He nodded once. She broke the seal gently, unfolding the brittle paper. The handwriting was slanted, beautiful. "Elias, if you find this, it means I'm gone, or I've run. Either way, don't come looking. The truth is heavier than you think, and you don't deserve to carry it anymore. But I hope one day you'll forgive me for not telling you everything. I never stopped loving you, not even for a moment. Clara." Emma looked up. Elias was staring at the letter like he hadn't seen it in years. "Did she run?" she asked softly. "Or was she taken?" "I never found out," he said. "One day, she was just gone. No signs of struggle, no goodbye. But she left this," Emma whispered. Elias's jaw tightened. The house found it years later. In the wall, behind the mirror in her room. The room felt colder suddenly. Emma shivered, despite the lantern's warmth. "She called it a burden," Emma said. "What truth was she protecting you from?" Elias's eyes finally met hers. "I don't know. Or maybe I do, and I've spent the last 30 years pretending I don't. They stood in silence, the past pressing in from every direction. Emma's thoughts spun. She wasn't just on a story assignment anymore. This wasn't just a house. It was a vault of unsolved love, a mausoleum of memory, and she was caught in its grip. Something scratched against the stone wall. She turned quickly. "Did you hear that?" Elias didn't answer. He was already moving, toward a darker corner of the cellar where the stones seemed less settled. "Wait," she called. "What is it?" He knelt and touched the wall. A slow, hollow knock responded. Emma's breath caught. It knocked again, from the other side. The knock echoed a third time, soft, deliberate, too rhythmic to be structural. It was a message, not a creak. Emma stood frozen, the letter still in her hand, her eyes on the damp stone wall. Elias pressed his palm against the uneven surface, moving it slowly in circles, like he was feeling for something only he could sense. Then, click, a hidden latch gave way. A whisper of cold air slipped through the sudden seam in the wall. Dust fell like ash as the stones split apart with a low groan, revealing a narrow passage just wide enough to walk through sideways. The smell of old earth and forgotten time wafted out like breath from a tomb. Elias lit a second lantern from the wall sconce and passed it to Emma. "You don't have to go in." She didn't hesitate. "Yes, I do." The walls of the tunnel were stone and clay, reinforced with old beams that looked as if they'd grown under their own memory. Each step felt like a descent into something sacred or cursed. After 10 paces, the tunnel widened into a room, a hidden chamber. It was round, small, no more than 15 feet across, but its ceiling rose like a dome. Dust floated in the air, undisturbed for decades. In the center stood a metal-framed bed with no mattress, only a tattered quilt, stained with time. Around the room, shelves stacked with books, photographs, and personal items, lipstick, perfume, a worn leather-bound journal. Emma's breath caught. It was a room someone had lived in, hidden, and not just for days. "Was this Clara's?" she whispered. Elias stepped inside, his face pale in the lantern light. "I didn't know this existed." He ran a finger across a shelf. It came away black with dust, except for one spot. Something had been moved. Recently. Emma turned slowly. On the wall hung a mirror, oval, ornate, but cracked in 3 places. Below it, a vanity chair was pulled out just slightly, as though someone had sat there and stood again. Her heart beat in her throat. "She was here," she murmured. "Longer than you thought." "I searched for her," Elias said hoarsely. "For months. I had people looking. Police. Nothing. They said she ran, that she didn't want to be found." Emma walked to the vanity. There was a compact still resting open, the powder untouched. A dried lily rested next to it. She picked up the flower gently. The stem cracked in her fingers. "Someone's been here recently," she said. He nodded slowly. "I think you were meant to find this." Emma turned to him. "Why me?" "I don't know yet," Elias said, stepping closer. "But ever since you arrived, the house has started to breathe again. It reacts to you." "That's poetic," she said. "It's more than that." Their eyes locked again, and this time neither looked away. She felt it in her chest first, a low hum, a pull, like the space between them was charged with something heavy and electric. Not just attraction, recognition. And for a second, she didn't feel like herself. Not Emma Carter, journalist from Atlanta. She felt watched, not by Elias, but by memory itself. By Clara. "I need air," she whispered. Elias followed her out, neither of them speaking until they emerged from the tunnel and back into the lower cellar. Emma took a breath, but it didn't help. The dust of the past was inside her now. She turned to Elias. "Did you love her?" He nodded, solemn. "With everything I had left." "And now," she asked, "are you seeing her in me?" "Yes," he said softly, "but I'm trying not to." That admission hung between them, raw and dangerous. They stood in silence again, not knowing what to say. Then, a sound. From upstairs. A clatter, sharp and deliberate, like a chair overturned. Then, silence. Emma and Elias exchanged a look. "I thought you said no one else lived here," she said. "I did." He moved toward the cellar stairs. Emma followed. They emerged back into the main hallway of the house, where the storm had finally arrived. Wind howled against the windows. Curtains danced like spirits across the hardwood floor. In the parlor, a single armchair had tipped over. The fire in the hearth was out. And there, on the coffee table, lay a photograph Emma hadn't seen before. She picked it up slowly. The frame was cracked. Inside, a photo of Clara and Elias. Only they weren't smiling. They were arguing. A shadow loomed behind them, half seen, indistinct, almost like a figure blurred in the background. Emma shivered. Elias looked over her shoulder at the photo. "I don't remember this being here," he said. "I don't think it was." Lightning flared outside. The room went black. Then, slowly, the lights flickered back. Elias was still beside her, but his expression had changed. He looked shaken, like he'd seen a ghost. Thunder rolled overhead like an ancient beast shifting in its sleep. Emma stood still, clutching the photo, her pulse quickening. The air had turned thick, humid with storm and silence. Elias didn't speak. His face was unreadable, but there was a tremor in his fingers that betrayed something he was trying hard to control. "Are you sure you didn't put this here?" she asked again, motioning to the photo. Elias shook his head slowly. It was locked in storage. That photo was never framed. "So how?" "I told you," he said, his voice rougher than before. "This house doesn't forget, and sometimes it doesn't forgive either." The lights flickered again, briefly illuminating the worn rug, the grand piano, the crack that spidered across the ceiling like a growing fracture. Then darkness claimed the room once more. Emma turned toward the hallway. "We should light candles. Or something." Elias nodded and disappeared into the side cabinet, returning with a brass candelabra and a box of matches. As he lit the wicks one by one, their flames cast long shadows across the walls, shadows that shifted even when they shouldn't. The storm outside reached its crescendo. Rain slammed against the windows like a warning. But inside, Emma felt drawn not to shelter, but to the hidden room. Clara's room. She turned to Elias. "I need to see her journal." He hesitated. "It's not easy to read." Neither was her letter. Without another word, they descended again, through the narrow stairwell, past the stone walls, into the silence of the underground room. Clara's chamber looked unchanged, frozen in time. Emma crossed to the vanity. The journal lay beside the powder case and the dried lily. She picked it up, reverently, like it might dissolve in her hands. The leather was soft with age, the binding cracked. She flipped through slowly. The entries were dated, handwritten, full of pauses, as if Clara had written them during moments stolen from something larger. She began reading aloud. "May 4th, Elias brought roses today. He doesn't know I've been followed. I didn't tell him. I don't want to see that look in his eyes again, the one that says he'd kill for me if I asked." Emma glanced up at Elias, whose jaw had tensed, but he said nothing. She continued. "May 9th. The agency wants me gone. They think the mission is compromised. I'm tired. I want to tell him everything. But if I do, he'll never trust me again." Emma's fingers tightened on the edge of the page. "May 15th. I heard someone in the hallway last night. Not Elias. He was asleep. I think they're inside now. Watching. Waiting." Lightning cracked, so loud it shook the floor beneath them. "Elias," she whispered. She was afraid. He nodded once. She was being watched. We both were. I didn't want to believe it. Emma flipped to the final page, dated May 19th. There was only one sentence written. "I love him too much to stay. I love him too much to run." Then a smear of ink, like the pen had been yanked away mid-thought. The rest of the page was blank. Emma looked up slowly. She was torn apart by loyalty, she said, and guilt. "She shouldn't have carried it alone," Elias replied, his voice hoarse. "She didn't want you to." They stood in the quiet, surrounded by her echoes. Emma closed the journal and cradled it in her arms like it was still warm. "I feel like I know her," she said softly. "But I also feel like I'm not supposed to." Elias stepped closer. The heat between them returned, fierce and confusing. "You remind me of her," he said, his voice low. "But you're not her. You're different. And that scares me more." "Why?" she asked, her eyes not leaving his. "Because if I let myself care again, and lose you too." His words faded into the crackling quiet. Emma didn't speak. Instead, she reached out, slowly, deliberately, and touched his hand. The contact was simple, human, but the tension it released was electric. They stood like that, in the candlelit dark, thunder vibrating above them. Then, a knock. From upstairs. Not a creak. A knock. 2 short taps. Deliberate. As if on a door. They looked at each other. "That's not the wind," Emma said. Elias nodded grimly. "No, it isn't." Without speaking, they moved together, climbing the stairs, the house groaning with each step, as if it resented being disturbed again. In the foyer, the knocking stopped. And on the doormat, a letter, yellowed, addressed to Elias Reed, in Clara's handwriting. The envelope was thick, worn at the edges, and sealed with a faded red wax that had cracked with time. The name on the front, Elias Reed, was written in the same looping cursive as Clara's journal, unmistakable and alive despite the decades. Emma reached for it, but Elias stopped her, his fingers brushing hers. "I should read it," he said, his voice raw. She nodded and stepped back. He broke the seal with a thumb. The wax crumbled like old bone. Inside, the paper had yellowed but held firm. His eyes scanned the letter silently at first. Then his lips began to move, reading the words aloud, like they needed to be heard by more than just him. "Elias, if this letter finds you, then the house still remembers. It means it kept the part of me I had to hide. It means someone worthy found it, and you let them. You were never meant to know everything. I didn't lie out of malice, only out of duty. They were watching me, even as they watched you. I was meant to lure out an enemy, but instead I fell in love with one. They told me to disappear. I chose to stay, hidden in the walls of the only place I'd ever felt safe. I watched you walk the halls. I saw your grief. I kept a piece of myself here, in the hope that someone might one day help you let me go. Maybe she already has." Elias stopped reading. Emma stood, her arms crossed tightly, as if bracing against something rising from deep inside. "She stayed," she said slowly. "She hid here, and you never knew." "I searched," Elias whispered. "But never here, never beneath. I thought she'd run, betrayed me. And all this time, you mourned a ghost," Emma said. "No," he corrected, his voice firming. "I mourned a life I thought I didn't deserve to keep." Emma's mind whirled. "But how did this letter appear now?" "I don't know," Elias admitted. Unless she left it for when the house chose someone new." He turned to her, eyes haunted but clear. "I think that's you." Emma took a step back, not out of fear, but confusion. The weight of Clara's story, the intensity in Elias's gaze, it all pressed down at once. "I'm not her," she said quietly. "I'm not your second chance." "I know," Elias said. "But you're here, and that means something." Thunder growled low in the distance. The storm was beginning to pass, but inside the house, something else was breaking open. Emma clutched the journal tighter. "I need to get some air," she said. "I need space to think." "I'll give you that," Elias said. "But don't leave just yet." She didn't answer. She walked through the grand hallway, past the watching portraits and the flickering candlelight, and stepped out onto the wraparound porch. The rain had slowed to a mist, the sky dimming into blue-gray twilight. She sat on the porch swing, the journal on her lap, Clara's words still echoing in her head. She chose to stay because she loved him, but Clara had also known it would destroy her. And now, Emma was walking that same line. She opened the journal again, flipping through the pages. One fell out. It was a photo of Clara, laughing, sitting on the swing where Emma now sat. On the back, scribbled in pen, "Sometimes love lives longer than the body." but it needs someone new to carry it. Emma's hands trembled. Was this fate? Or was she just the next story this house wanted to write? She looked back toward the door, where 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐤 still stood in shadow, watching her, not possessively, but hopefully. And for the first time, Emma didn't know if she wanted to walk away. The mist drifted across the porch like the ghost of rain, clinging to Emma's skin and hair, curling into her breath. The air was damp, sweet with honeysuckle, and still, almost reverent. Inside, candlelight danced in the windows. Emma stared down at the photograph in her lap again. Clara on this swing. A smile unguarded, caught in motion. Someone had taken this photo without her knowing, and yet she looked straight into the lens, as if she'd known it would matter someday, as if she'd known someone else would find it. Her thumb brushed the message on the back. Sometimes love lives longer than the body. A creak behind her. Emma didn't need to look. 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐤 stepped onto the porch, slowly, not wanting to startle her. She heard the faint click of the door closing behind him, the hush of his steps on the wood. "May I sit?" he asked. She nodded, still facing forward. He lowered himself beside her on the swing, careful not to rock it too much. His hands were folded in his lap. The silence between them was rich, not awkward, but tight with things unsaid. "I'm not sure what this is," Emma said finally, her voice low. "You, me, Clara, this house." 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐤 looked out into the fog. "Neither am I, but I know it's not an accident. You think everything's fate. No, but I think sometimes grief calls out, and something answers." She turned to him then. "Do you think Clara wanted me here?" "I think she wanted you to free me," he said. "Or maybe, free yourself." Emma's pulse quickened. The air between them thickened again, that same hum from before, deep and undeniable. But now it burned hotter. "I'm not her," she whispered. "I don't want you to be." He reached out, not fast, not demanding, just enough to offer. His hand hovered near her cheek, and when she didn't pull away, he touched her skin gently. His thumb traced the edge of her jaw, slow, reverent. Emma's breath hitched. His touch was warm, human, but it sparked like something elemental. They leaned in at the same time. When their lips met, it wasn't explosive, it was slow, melting, like an echo of something ancient returning to flesh. His hand slid to her neck, her fingers to his chest. The kiss deepened, not rushed, but full of gravity, like they were falling into something far bigger than either of them. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together. "Tell me this is real," she whispered. "I'm not sure what's real anymore," 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐤 said. "But you are." The swing rocked gently, carrying them in silence. And then the house answered. A thump, low, deliberate, from somewhere deep inside. Not a threat, a summons. 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐤 stiffened. That came from the west wing. Emma stood. "What's there?" "A door I haven't opened in years." They went together, side by side, down the hallway that grew colder with every step. The west wing was different, more decayed, less touched. Dust clung thick to the air. Wallpaper peeled in long strips like forgotten skin. At the end of the hall was a door sealed with rusted hinges. 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐤 reached for the handle. It turned without resistance. Inside was a room nearly empty, save for a small writing desk and an armchair turned to face the window. Emma stepped in first and froze. On the desk lay a letter addressed to Emma Carter. The ink was fresh. The seal was Clara's. The letter was impossibly real. Not yellowed, not aged. The paper was crisp, the ink still drying, its faint curl pulling at the edge as if it had only just been placed there. Emma didn't move. "Did you write this?" she asked 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐤, not turning around. "No," he said softly, stepping beside her. "I swear." The envelope read, "Emma Carter, when memory is no longer enough." It wasn't 𝐤𝐤𝐤𝐤's handwriting. It wasn't hers. It was Clara's. With trembling fingers, Emma broke the seal and unfolded the page. The scent that drifted up was subtle, rose water and old paper. She braced herself and read aloud, voice cracking as each word landed like a stone in still water. "Emma, if you're reading this, The house has chosen. That means it's still listening, still remembering, still aching. I was never supposed to love Elias. But love doesn't follow orders. It isn't rational. It doesn't care about missions or secrets. I watched him grieve me. I watched him build walls to survive what I did. I couldn't tell him I was still here, that I lived behind mirrors and beneath floorboards. I became a ghost in my own life. But I felt you, even before you arrived. Your steps in the hallway, your questions, your breath beside his. You are not my replacement. You are my release. Take what I could not carry. Choose what I could not face. Live. Clara. Emma's knees nearly gave out. She lowered herself into the armchair facing the window. Her heartbeat rang in her ears. The room was silent. Even the house waited. Elias dropped to one knee in front of her. He didn't speak, just took her hands in his and held them like they were the only real things in the world. She met his eyes. She knew I'd come. He nodded. She wanted me to set you free. Maybe both of us. Emma looked at the letter again, then up at the room. The wallpaper here was newer. The furniture arranged like someone had once lived here, maybe even recently. She wrote this today, Elias. This wasn't from years ago. I know. How is that possible? I don't think she ever left. The hair on Emma's arms rose. The candle in the hall guttered violently, then extinguished. They sat in silence. I need to leave tomorrow, Emma whispered, though she didn't believe it yet. I need to breathe in a world that isn't soaked in memory. Elias swallowed. I won't stop you. But part of me wants to stay, she added. Why? Because I feel her in me, Emma said. And I feel something else. Me? She shook her head. Us. This. Whatever this is. Elias stood, stepped back, gave her space. I've lived with ghosts long enough. If you stay, it should be for life, not for shadows. Emma stood too. If I go, will you let me come back? I'll leave the door open. She stepped toward him, their faces inches apart. I don't know what tomorrow looks like, she said. You don't have to, he replied. Just let it come. Their lips met again, but this time, it wasn't driven by heat or haunted grief. It was something quieter, a recognition, a promise not yet spoken aloud. When they parted, Emma folded the letter, slid it into her jacket, and turned toward the door. Outside, the wind had died. The house, at last, was still. The morning came slow, as if the sun were reluctant to rise over Halcyon House. Emma sat on the edge of the guest bed, fully dressed, staring at her packed bag. The journal rested beside it, along with Clara's final letter, neatly folded like a completed chapter. Outside, the birds had returned. The storm had passed, but the trees still wept. She stepped into the hallway barefoot, letting the wood floor cool her thoughts. The portraits along the walls no longer seemed to watch her. The house no longer leaned in to listen. It breathed, deep, quiet, restful. She found Elias in the kitchen, pouring coffee, his sleeves rolled up, the soft light making him look younger. He turned and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes fully. Leaving? Emma nodded. For now. I won't ask you to stay. I know, she said. But that's what makes it harder. They sat at the table like two people who had lived a life together, though they hadn't. Not yet. She pulled something from her bag, a velvet pouch, and placed it between them. Inside was the photograph of Clara and Elias, the one from the cellar. The one that haunted them both. I think she's finally let go, Emma said. Elias looked at the photo, then nodded. And you? Emma stood. I think I need to live a little before I choose where to stay. He stood too. Will I see you again? She stepped forward and kissed him, not with sadness, but with clarity. You already have, she whispered. You just didn't know it. At the front door, she paused, hand on the handle. The house, she said, glancing back. Yes. Elias asked. It doesn't feel haunted anymore. No, he agreed. Now it just feels full. She smiled. Goodbye, Elias. Goodbye, Emma. She stepped out into the morning light. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes. The swing on the porch rocked once, just once, then went still. As her car pulled away, she didn't look back. But inside her coat pocket, Clara's letter pressed gently against her heart, like a hand from the past saying, "Go. I've been waiting long enough." Do you think Emma made the right decision by walking away? Was Elias truly free? Or did he just find a new kind of waiting? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take on the ending. And don't forget to subscribe to get more stories about forbidden love.